Hello. I have to say, I am so excited and humbled and incredibly anxious and nervous to be here. I am Natalie DeFreitas. I am a mental health counselor, and I'm also a restorative justice advocate and a justice consultant. And I'm here to talk with you all about the crisis in our justice system. And I want to share a little bit about how I believe restorative justice to offer a solution to this crisis. So I was preparing for this talk, and I was reading some headlines, and I came across one that said that right now in Canada, the crime rate is the lowest it's been in 40 years. And I've got to tell you that I was baffled by this, because doing the work that I do, I've never believed that our system has been more failed. So I started to think, okay, maybe the statistic is a little bit skewed. How did we get to this lowest crime rate in 40 years? And in short, we've done this by locking everyone up. We have locked up everyone despite their age or whether or not it's their first time committing an offense. And I started thinking, well, is this statistic sustainable? I mean, what happens when all of these people that we're locking up are released? Will our communities still be safe? Will they reoffend? Well, the crisis that I see centers around mass incarceration. So a little bit about myself. When I was 18, I started working in about 6 different jails when I was doing my undergraduate degree in Kingston, Ontario. My mom likes to joke that I've done time, but I really had some powerful conversations there. And I realized that there was a better way to do justice. So I want to share 3 things with you all today. The first is I want to give you just a brief overview of some of the current problems in our system. The second is, I want to share an extreme example, sort of a case study of some of the problems that I'm illustrating. And then finally, I want to talk to you about my passion, restorative justice, and why I believe that this is a solution. So when we think about where we're at today, what is our current approach to justice? Well, in short, life doesn't mean life. So this means that the majority of offenses that are committed in Canada receive relatively short jail terms. And moreover, the ones that do get longer sentences and even life terms are eligible for parole after serving only a portion of that time. And something even more powerful is that 70% of people reoffend within 1 year after being released from jail. I want you to think about that. How effective is our system of justice if 70% of people are reoffending after jail? So the problem with this, as I see it, is that people are sent back into the exact same negative social circumstances that influenced crime in the first place. And you know the stories, things like racism, illiteracy, poverty, addictions. But our current answer has just been to build bigger and better prisons, to lock up more people. And I think, and this is my perspective, that this is dealing with the symptoms of crime and not the causes. So prisons have become revolving doors and our communities remain unsafe. So I wanted to provide you with a case study and sort of an extreme example of harsh on crime approaches to justice at its best. So let's talk about Texas for a second, y'all. Well, we all know what Texas is known for, right? They do everything big in Texas, and this includes their approach to justice. So some of you may have even heard the nicknames. They are the shoot-'em-up state. Huntsville, Texas is the death penalty capital of the world, or execution city. Some pretty powerful nicknames. But what started happening was after decades of using these harsh on crime approaches and mass incarceration, in the 90s, crime rates started to skyrocket. And not only that, but prisons were overcrowded and overpopulated. It was standing room only, seriously. And state officials took notice of this. Because really, when you're locking everyone and everyone up, shouldn't crime rates be going down? So they started thinking that something new needed to be done. And they started developing alternative programs. So these were things that focused more on some of the influencers of crime, things like addictions workshops and other social programming. And judges started handing out parole instead of jail time. And what they noticed between the years 2005 and 2012 was a dramatic reduction in crime rates. And not only that, but there were less people actually in prison. And even better than that, it cost about a tenth of what it cost to imprison one inmate to run these alternative programs. So I share this example with you because Texas has actually been instrumental in using themselves as an example. We've been there, we've done that, it doesn't work. And they have been calling out governments all over the world to re-examine the ways that they're doing justice, including our own government. And I share this with you just to show an example that there are alternatives to the way justice is being done in North America. But I'm here to talk to you about restorative justice, and this is something I'm very passionate about, but I have to admit it's a very difficult concept to define. It's experiential. So I thought, well, some of my favorite TED Talks share stories. And so I'm going to share a story with you all about one of my experiences working with a former offender in restorative justice. And I hope that you'll have a little bit of a feel for what this process is. And so the story centers around someone that I'll call John. And when John was 18 years old, he was arrested for dealing drugs. And this is around the time that I met him. And something really, really cool happened. When he was at trial, he was met with a judge that saw an opportunity. And that judge was an advocate for restorative justice processes. And he gave John a choice. He said he could either go through a restorative justice program, and if he was successful, he could potentially have his charges dropped, his record cleared, or he could go through a traditional court trial process, which was his right, but if he was found guilty, there was a potential for facing jail time. So John obviously chose restorative justice, not fully well knowing what he was getting himself into. But this process was multifaceted for him. As part of it, he had to meet in a group, a circle, and he met with stakeholders in this circle process over the course of a couple of months every week. And these people included community members, teachers, police officers, his family members, people that were impacted by his actions. And he had to sit there and he had to talk about why he did what he did. He had to take accountability for what he had done. And this might seem simple, but it's really complex. And so he was resistant at first. He found it difficult. He thought it was all silly. He didn't really get the point. But as the weeks went on, he started developing a rapport with the people in the group. And he started opening up. So he shared a little bit of his story. He spoke about what it was like for him to grow up in an inner city neighborhood where there was zero access to positive social role models. He was witnessing crime and violence every day as if they were commonplace. And at a young age, he witnessed his best friend shot and killed in front of him. He spoke about his difficulties in the education system. He talked about how he was basically functionally illiterate and how this caused him so much shame that he dropped out of school. He spoke about racism and poverty. He spoke about growing up in a single-parent family. He talked about his mom being so ill that she couldn't financially provide for the family and left him to be the sole financial provider at a very young age. And he spoke about this with anger and frustration. But he also talked about love. And he talked about his desire to protect his family and his desire to be part of a community in which he felt no place. And so something really significant came out of this. As he shared, those deep wounds that had influenced John to make the decisions that he had made began to be sutured up. And the reason this happened was because he was able to share in an environment that was supportive without guilting or shaming him. Now, he said that one of the most important things he took from this was that for the first time in his life, he had a voice. So he was able to share his story. People cared, they listened. And not only did he have to share his voice, but he had to listen to others' voices too. So he directly saw the impact of what he had done and how it affected others around him. Now, I want you to think about how different this is from our traditional form of justice. In a court, the people who are actually impacted by the crime, their voices are silenced. And professionals, people that are educated, that often come from very different class structures, they do the talking for them. And so there's no opportunity for this healing to happen. Now, John also had to be part of a sentencing circle. And this is really a pinnacle of restorative justice, is people have to take appropriate accountability for what they've done. And so as part of this, the group decided that what would be in John's best interest and the community's best interest was to have John develop a comprehensive plan for how he was going to avoid criminal behavior in the future. So as part of this, John had to re-enroll back in school, something that was incredibly difficult for him considering his struggles in the education system. He had to take resume building workshops and he had to find a job. And eventually he even applied for college after he obtained his GED. Now, what was significant about this to John was that it directly related to the causes of crime in his life. So things like not having a job, being unable to provide financially for a family, having no education, led for him to resort to dealing drugs to make a quick buck. And so he had an opportunity here to transform a part of himself that he'd never tapped into. And the point is here that John identified for the remainder or for the duration of his life that he had been labeled a criminal by those around him. So that became ingrained in his identity. It became very difficult to extricate himself from that. If I'm a criminal, I might as well keep acting like one. This is something I hear all the time. And what this did was it allowed John to transform a negative self-identity and reinvest in social connection, reinvest in his own choices to reconnect with the community, to make positive and social decisions. And he wouldn't have had this opportunity had it not been for this process. So, where is John today? Well, John is crime-free. He's a college student, and he's got a bright future ahead of him. But I can't help but wonder where the justice is in this case. What would have happened if he had chosen to go to jail? Would John have reoffended? Would he have changed? And I think the problem here actually lies with us, with all of us here. Because we as a society equate justice with punishment. So when something awful happens in a community, you often hear about a cry out for justice. And what we think this means is revenge, stigma, and jail. But what we know is that our current system of punishment is not working. Remember back to that 70% reoffense rate. So how can punishment alone be real justice? There's no incentive for an offender to want to change only by sitting locked up in a cell. There's no way for them to see the impact of their actions by being locked up in a cell. So the focus of restorative justice centers around reconnection. Now, oftentimes people ask how I can work with those that have done some pretty horrible things. And a mentor explained this to me in the best way, and she said, Natalie, imagine that the worst thing you've ever done was on display for the world to see. And I'd like you to take a second and think about that. Imagine the thing that you are most ashamed of, the worst thing that you've ever done, was on display for the world to see. Now, restorative justice centers on a really important principle, that people are worth more than the worst thing that they've ever done. And you know, this really resonated for me because as a counselor, oftentimes I hear about people's darkest or most vulnerable or shameful states. And I think that it's these moments that connect us as humans. So I wanted to talk about the bottom line as well. It costs in Canada about $115,000 a year to put one person in jail. And a restorative justice program costs about $10,000. If 70% of people reoffend after jail time alone, 15% of people reoffend after restorative justice. So restorative justice is evidence-based. It's being used internationally and within Canada with great success. It's being used preventatively in schools, something really cool. It's also been used in First Nations communities for centuries and centuries. And I have to say, because I've got a lot of lawyer and judge friends, and they'd probably kick me if I didn't say this, that it is not mutually exclusive with our current system. So like in John's case, it can actually be used by courts, lawyers, judges that support it, and that will offer better outcomes for their clients. So I wanted to leave you with a few final thoughts. So I have a prediction that if we continue with tough on crime approaches, and if we continue with mass incarceration, we will see a dramatic increase in our crime rates over the long term. And we will see unsafe communities for our future generations. I also believe that tough on crime actually does the opposite. It promotes crime. And if we're serious about reducing crime rates, we need restorative justice programs that focus on healing, transforming negative self-identities, and taking appropriate accountability. And I want to leave you with the final thought that justice is not something that happens to you. Justice is something that we build. Thank you very much.